Well, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at one of the specific wars of control, and that was King William's War. Now, the strange thing about all of these conflicts is they usually have 2, 3, sometimes 16 different names. Kind of depends on where you were, what you called it. Now, if you were in Europe at this time, it was typically called the War of the Grand Alliance, which is very grandiose sounding and sounds kind of cool because it did involve all these different powers. But over here in the New World, it was simply known as King William's War. Now, I'll give you an idea of when this occurred. I'll give you the dates. It occurred from 1689 to 1697. And this kind of began with the king of France, who was Louis XIV, sometimes referred to as the Sun King, one of the greatest and most powerful monarchs of all of French history. And Louis XIV was no friend of the Reformation. In fact, he was a great enemy to the Huguenots. He was one of those who really drove them out further, who essentially allowed that whole massacre of them to occur, and like I said, was no friend to them. He was their great enemy. Well, what he began doing was, with all the power he gained, he began to take over what he saw as French lands in Europe that were controlled by the Habsburgs, particularly against the Germans. As a result, the Habsburgs went to war with him. To gain further power, what Louis XIV did was he made an alliance with the Ottoman Turks. Now, that may just sound like a lot of complexity, and I suppose it kind of is complex, but here's the point I want you to think about. Louis XIV represents a Christian nation. The Germans and the Habsburgs also represent a Christian nation. They're not fighting over a just reason, they're fighting over land. And in order to gain the upper hand, what Louis XIV did was he allied with the Muslims, who usually were trying to take over Christian lands and turn them into Muslim governments. And so what he does is he shows that he's quite willing to make a deal with something that he knows to be wrong in order to gain more power and influence for himself. This is why these are called the wars of control. This is why these are not wars for justice or for mercy in any form whatsoever. But what this war did was it brought the fighting over here to the colonies, since the Habsburgs and the French, as well as the English, all had colonies over here. Now, before this war ever began, the French and the English, in order to kind of keep each other in check, had gone and they had both made native allies here in the New World. In fact, specifically, the French had allied themselves with the Hurons and with the Algonquins. And the idea was that if they ever did go into a war, particularly with the English, they could call upon the Algonquins or call upon the Hurons to help them fight. Well, the English weren't going to be outdone by the French, so they made an alliance with the Iroquois, which is a very powerful nation of tribes up in the northeast of the present-day U.S. Well, all of this might seem fine, but they made a very specific kind of treaty. It's what we call an aggression treaty. And the way that an aggression treaty works is like this. If you're the French and you're allied with the Huron, if the Huron decide to make war on somebody or they get attacked, then you suddenly, by your treaty, have to fight alongside the Huron to make war against whoever they may have attacked or whoever attacked them. So it means that the Huron and the Iroquois and the Algonquin, who by nature often went to war with each other, could very easily drag the French and English into a war that neither the French nor the English actually wanted. This is exactly what happened in 1680 when the Iroquois decided to launch a war on the Huron. The Huron called the French in, the Iroquois called the English in, and as a result, the two powers both began to fight in the New World. But there was one primary issue. Neither the French nor the English had many regular soldiers over here. For example, for the British, that would be those redcoats, those guys who were highly trained and very well equipped. There were hardly any of them here in the Americas. And so what the French and the English had to do was they had to rely upon the local militias. The militias were essentially the small military forces that were basically made up of common people. People like your parents, essentially, like your father, like your uncle, like your older brother, perhaps. These were people who typically just worked for a living. They were farmers, for example, or they owned maybe a blacksmith shop, or they were a simple merchant, something along those lines. These were not professional soldiers. These were not people who thought about war all the time. They only went to war when they absolutely had to. As a result, these wars were fought by the militias who often just wanted home more than anything else. Not only that, but because these wars were fought by natives who didn't simply attack other soldiers, because these wars were fought by natives, these natives had the mindset or had the worldview that if you really want to hurt your enemy, you have to attack his home. Not his military base, but his home. You have to actually attack where he lives and attack the people he loves, such as his wife, such as his children, such as his neighbors, and so forth. And so this war, King William's War, was especially noted for its attacks on villages, places like Falmouth, Massachusetts, or Dover, New Hampshire, or York, Massachusetts. Those were all targeted by the Algonquins and their various allies. The Iroquois did the same to the French when they attacked the town of Laquine, Quebec. Either way, though, by 1689, when King William's War began, both the British and the French were tired of the attacks on villages, so they signed peace treaties, but then they both immediately violated those peace treaties. As a result, it went into a long conflict that actually involved most of the empires of Europe. It led to yet another attack at a place called Schenectady, Massachusetts, when in 1689, another village was actually attacked and many people were once again massacred, people who had nothing to do with the war itself. Eventually, a peace treaty would be signed, but neither side gained anything. And that's kind of the lesson of all of these wars of control. Sometimes they would just trade lands. Sometimes they might actually gain a small bit of power, but never anything significant, and certainly never anything that was worth all the cost to get there in the first place. Now, before we finish this video today, I want to mention one more primary war, and that was Queen Anne's War. This is also sometimes called the War of Spanish Succession, because it was a dispute over who should rule the Habsburg lands in Spain. Now, its dates are 1702 to 1713, and it began with the grandson of Louis XIV. His name was Philip V, and he was a French king. He decided that since nobody was essentially ruling over the Habsburg lands in Spain and the areas of France, that he would just make himself ruler. He actually took over 22 individual kingdoms or territories that belonged to the Habsburgs, and this actually began the war. And because so many of the European nations were allied with each other, they suddenly all found themselves involved in yet another fight, but they all seemed to have the idea of, oh, good, this is our opportunity to defeat the French. This is our opportunity to take over Spanish kingdoms that we've always been coveting and wanting all along. Once again, though, places in the New World, particularly places like Deerfield, Massachusetts, were targeted by the natives who were also brought into this conflict. In fact, I want you to note the year 1703. That's when the village of Deerfield, Massachusetts was attacked at night by a group of Algonquins, and about 56 people, from what we can tell from records, were actually slaughtered in this attack. These were older people, these were women, these were men, these were children. There really was no discrimination taken. Over 100 of them, however, were captured. One of those was a man by the name of John Williams, who was a pastor. This was a man who actually would be the uncle of Jonathan Edwards, a famous American pastor of later days. But he suffered terribly in this attack. He lost both his 6-year-old son and a 6-week-old daughter, who was massacred by the natives when they attacked his village. He was then taken to their village, and he was kept as a prisoner for 2 years until he escaped, came back home, rewrote his memoir of what had happened. It was a book that he published. It was called The Redeemed Captive Returns to Zion. But when people picked up this book throughout the colonies, or picked up this book throughout England, and they read what these allies of the French had done, they were furious and they wanted revenge. The problem, of course, is that the English native allies did the exact same thing. It wasn't as if there was one side who was good and one side who was the bad guys. Both sides were quite willing to use natives and this kind of warfare of attacking women and children to gain advantage. That's why these wars of control were so opposite. They were antithetical, using that word antithesis we talked about earlier. They were antithetical to the whole idea of home or parish settlement. Not only that, but pirates were used heavily during this time. There were pirate attacks on places like Charleston. There were pirate attacks on places like St. Augustine in Florida, or places like Pensacola. And even when the peace treaty was finally signed, there was essentially no gain. There was essentially nothing that either side got. So as a result, the various nations, like Spain, like France, like England, they turned to piracy. Even though they had signed a peace treaty, they said, okay, we still want to gain something from the enemy. And so they hired pirates. They gave them a document that basically showed that they had the right to attack other ships and steal whatever treasure was on board and kill anyone who got in their way. And as a result, this began to happen heavily. Now, one of the guys caught up in the piracy, and particularly in smuggling, his name was Robert Jenkins. And Robert Jenkins was just kind of a common guy who was just basically a sailor. And he really would have been forgotten had it not been for a single incident that occurred after the War of Queen Anne. What happened was he was stopped by a Spanish ship. Jenkins himself was an Englishman, flying the flag of England on board his ship. When the Spanish came on board his ship, they demanded that he reveal what he was smuggling. He refused, so they tied him to the mast. The Spanish captain then drew his saber, and he cut off the ear of Jenkins. And he said to him, "This is what we're going to do to your king if we ever capture him." Well, Jenkins was kind of a brilliant marketer. He was a man who was not going to let this defeat him. So, strangely, he kept the ear. That may seem strange to you, but let me tell you why he kept the ear. He kept the ear, he had it preserved somehow, and then he had it attached to a chain which he wore around his neck. He then went back to England and began to tell people, "Look what the Spanish did to me. Look at my ear. They cut it off." He went and he actually became such a popular storyteller that the British Parliament heard him, and even the King of England heard him. They became so furious that the Spanish had dared to cut off his ear that they went to war against the Spanish. And this little war, during this period of history, is called, I'm not making this up, it's literally called the War of Robert Jenkins' Ear. If that's not insanity, and if that's not something that you would not want, if that's not something you wouldn't want to be involved in, then correct me. But that is something that the American colonists desperately wanted to escape because it was ridiculous. Anyway, we'll talk more about these ridiculous wars tomorrow.